right, so we're doing a solo pod, which I haven't done in a while. So if this is actually a format that you enjoy, please follow up with me and let me know, since this is something that I can do. I can set up a microphone and talk into it. So if you find value from this, let me know and can potentially release some more of these. But for this episode, I figured I'd do a follow-up to one of my more popular solo podcasts, which was actually on productivity and prioritization. And in that podcast, which was released a few years ago, I talked about a system called Getting Things Done, since I had recently reread that book and had found several things that were valuable to me that I started applying to my systems of productivity that I use to manage my businesses and just my own general life, since I'm kind of a freak who enjoys creating overly complicated systems and following them. But, oftentimes people say things to me like, wow, you get so much done. I can't believe how you do it all. How do you manage it, et cetera? And some of that I think is just kind of like, a thing that people say in conversation. And I generally don't take it as a real question, but I do think there are people who are, legitimately asking, how do you manage a lot of different projects at once, since it can be a difficult thing to do. And so, at some level, like I said before, there's a personality tendency to just want to create systems and execute on tasks that is certainly dialed pretty much all the way up in my brain, and, kind of independent of what I would actually be doing. I'd probably be just creating systems and executing on tasks. So there is just like a fundamental thing that I think is kind of wrong with me that puts me in that position. And you sort of couple that with whatever psychological flaw results in a constant pressure to be working and feeling like things are going badly and wrong if I'm not working. And, that's not necessarily something that you want, and it can be challenging for people around me, based upon the way that I can get agitated and not enjoy normal things that people like to do. So, that there are just these kind of like foundational elements of my personality that push me to kind of work obsessively. And there is an element of just brute force to doing a lot of different stuff, right? But I do think that I may have some things to say that are potentially helpful to people. And just to give a layout of the different kinds of things that I have going on, since I know some people who listen to this podcast may or may not actually pay attention to all the different projects that I do. But my main job is managing South Loop Strength and Conditioning gym in downtown Chicago. I also coach athletes and create some content through Legion Strength and Conditioning. We do mostly coaching for CrossFit competitive CrossFit athletes. And then I'm also in two bands. So two bands that I play guitar in, one that I'm the primary songwriter in, another that I do contribute some songs, but it's not my creative vision per se. And then I also obviously do this podcast that you are listening to now. And, through my own website, as well as just some of the other stuff, I send out a newsletter with a lot of content that I've consumed and paid attention to. And so based upon that, it seems like several things going on at once that, might be difficult to manage. And certainly there is an element of just like, okay, I just, relentlessly stack my schedule, my days as full as possible of different things and just kind of work relentlessly on them. And, that's not always going to be something that everyone wants to do. But that said, I think there are potentially some useful lessons to learn from freaks like me that might help people, achieve something more like quote unquote work-life balance, or the ability to maybe have one or two major projects that they work on and then have leisure time, rather than just saying, oh, great, I have bandwidth in my schedule. Let me add in 10 more things and completely fill it so that, I'm miserable and unhappy again based upon all the stuff that I've assigned myself. So, that's kind of a self-deprecating intro to this concept, but I do think that, I can hopefully give a few pieces of insight. So overall, big picture thing to think about is, I can give examples of what I do and how I think about it, but that in reality, every person is going to have to kind of adjust the framework that I potentially lay out to their own situation, right? So I sort of think of this like a Jane Jacobs model of productivity, right? So Jacobs is a legendary, let's say, urbanist who has a lot of theories about the development of cities and, the relationships of communities to the architecture that they're inhabiting, and is a big fan of sort of like bottoms up self-organization of communities and cities, as opposed to like a top-down regulated mandated, structure type of thing. She's a big fan of allowing communities and people to kind of like, self-organize and solve their problems, let's say. So I think that something like productivity and prioritization and efficiency, requires a combination of being aware and attempting to impose guidelines. But the purpose of guidelines is to facilitate this kind of, let's say, Jacobsian, that seems okay. Jacobsian self-organization of, the actual system when you're doing your work, right? And so I think that the best systems, getting things done is one of them, gives a significant amount of, let's say, leeway to the individual attempting to utilize it, and that facilitates it being an ongoing practice that they have, rather than kind of like a rigid, more structured thing that requires tremendous amounts of upkeep to even be utilizable. And then also just results in people kind of, burning out and not actually keeping up with their system. So, I've gone through a lot of different material about different productivity systems, and I've kind of hacked together bits and pieces of each of them to make something work. And, that it's very much like a work in progress. And a lot of it comes from me noticing, let's say, friction or challenges or frustration with something I'm trying to do. And then I'm like, okay, what's going wrong here? Why can I not figure out how to, let's say, get these athletes' programs done in time? Why do I feel horrible every time I try to, send out a newsletter? Why is this one project to improve the dashboards for the gym just sort of lagging and taking forever? And then when there's something that's going wrong, it's like, okay, what from a systemic perspective is potentially causing that to happen, right? And so I've kind of hacked things together and built things up based upon that. So to give like a zoomed out view of what I actually do currently that might be most helpful, is to think about like different layers of abstraction for projects and for productivity, right? So depending on what layer you're on, the appropriate thing to discuss is going to be different. At some layers, let's say that tactics are the most important thing, right? So like, how to actually send a blast email, for example, which is something that I've sort of fiddled with recently because the workflow for doing it was a little bit cumbersome and still resulted in a bunch of formatting problems. And so it's improved, right? And it's like, okay, that's a very tactical thing where it's like, every time I do this, I feel a little bit of friction. The result isn't particularly great. Let's work through and come up with like a better series of tactics to actually make this thing happen, right? And then on a more zoomed out level, it's like, okay, what are priorities and what are the most effective things that could be done right now, right? So like, is there something that can be done that would make everything else easier to do in the future? Is there something that is a major limiting factor for all the other things that we want done, right? Is there a specific outcome that, if accomplished, then actually changes the priorities in a positive direction everywhere else, right? So if we think about that very zoomed out view, I can use a specific example right now for what my priority is for the gym, which is actually improving the visualization and the ability of all of our staff to understand our metrics, right? That I've done a lot of work internally to build systems that do a lot of tracking of, lead funnels, visits to the website, consultations, conversion rates, how many monthly recurring memberships we have, members lost, reasons members are lost. Like, we have all this information that is now actually organized in a way that makes sense, and it's automated to kind of pull it together, which has been kind of like a really big ongoing project with a lot of positive learning for me in terms of my technical skills, but it's really not set up in a way that's terribly helpful for anyone else, right? That the way it's visualized is not super intuitive. It's kind of messy. If you're not really sure what's going on, like, people aren't going to want to click around weird dashboards that don't make a whole lot of sense. So that's something that I think that in terms of biggest priorities for the gym, if, at the stage that we're at, we can get everyone sort of aligned on improving our key metrics and also aligned in terms of like working together to make them better, that's the most important thing that we can do, right? That we have a lot of stuff that kind of works, but there's some issues in terms of the consistency of it. There's some issues in terms of accountability. It's just not always clear, like, okay, what actually is the thing that really, really matters? And that having this sort of big picture ability to view the business as a whole and communicate it effectively to everyone in the organization, that to me is the most important thing, right? So, okay, let's say that's my biggest priority right now for the business. And then from there, we start to go, we'll sort of start at the top and then we'll work our way down in terms of layers of abstraction, right? So from there, then we want to think about what kind of projects are actually going to move that forward, right? Can we come up with some sort of discrete project that has, let's say, a defined endpoint where once that project is complete, it can be checked off, the project can be archived, et cetera, right? So big picture, we want metrics that are viewable by everyone in the organization that actually make sense and communicate the information that is sort of stored in our databases. And then what's the next project? So I'll give an example of that. One of the things that's actually kind of challenging to keep track of is number of monthly recurring memberships, which is unfortunate because that's a massive KPI, like a key performance indicator for our business, right? Like how many people are paying for the gym every single month. And based upon the way that our software works, without getting too in the weeds with it's not super easy to pull that number because you get memberships that are on hold, memberships that are going to be dropped, people who have started a membership but haven't paid for it yet. Like there's just a lot of things that can go wrong there. So coming up with a dashboard that actually displays that number and tries to filter out a bunch of the things that have gone wrong, right? Like failed payments, holds, et cetera, is something that I think is a top priority. So that's a project that can be done. Once that dashboard is created, it's like, cool, check that box. This project has been successfully done, right? And so what I do then is every week I write down my project priorities, right? And I split these into 3 buckets. So one bucket is kind of like, let's say work projects, right? Like things like that, like, creating a dashboard, fixing a part of the website, designing an email sequence, rebuilding, like the class coaching schedule, which we're going to be doing shortly. Like something like that is a project that, falls into this like work bucket. Then I also have a bucket that's content projects. So for example, recording and editing and posting this podcast is a content project, right? Writing an article to be guest posted on the site or to potentially post on the Legion site or my own site, like that's a content project, right? If I know I'm doing an interview coming up for the podcast, researching the guest, I'm doing an interview with an academic coming up soon. And so downloading some of his papers and reading those and coming up with questions and sending them out, that's a content project. And then I also have admin projects, right? Which are things that aren't necessarily going to require a lot of focus and creativity, but need to be done, right? So for example, we use an automation service called Zapier that takes, like little things that happen on the internet, collects actions, and then you can just create a workflow based upon that. So let's say you get a Slack message in a certain channel, you can create a Zap that then sends an email to someone based upon that. Or if someone signs up and fills out a web form on a website, then you can trigger, adding them to another piece of software. So Zapier is something that is super useful for us. We use it in a ton of different ways in our different businesses. And the Slack integration for Zapier is outdated. So all of the apps that use the old Slack integration need to be updated. And that's going to be a pain in the ass and a hassle. And it just kind of has to be done, right? Not a ton of creativity there, just sort of sit there and grind it out. Potentially something else that might fit there is, catching up on email, something everyone hates, right? And I try to do a pretty good job of keeping up with email, but periodically I kind of let my inboxes overflow, and then I might make it a priority project for the week to just like actually catch up, respond to everything that needs to be responded to, something like that. So to recap, 3 buckets are like major work projects, content projects, and then sort of like administrative projects. And so on a weekly basis, I'll outline that and I'll write down the projects that are the priority for that week that I want to make sure I move forward. So in each of those buckets, it kind of depends on the week exactly how many there are, but ideally I'll have about 3 projects in each of those. And then potentially that list starts to balloon a little bit, gets up to like 5, 6, etc., which is not good. And I shouldn't do that because, you're not going to actually finish that. And for someone like me, having a bunch of unfinished stuff on a list makes me feel upset and bad, but I do it to myself every week. I write down 3 or so projects on Sunday, and then by Monday evening, it's ballooned to 6, and I know I'm not going to get it done. But anyway, that's for me to work out on my own, and, related to my intro, maybe something that I need to figure out from a friction perspective, a things going wrong perspective, what I can do to manage that. But I'll typically have, 3 plus or minus projects in each of those areas. And then on a daily basis, I'll actually pick one project from each bucket to try to move forward, right? So then I write my weekly projects in a little notebook, kind of divided into those 3 buckets. And then I have an app on my iPad called Palu, which is a calendar that enables you to actually write on it. And then every single day, I write in my calendar the 3 projects that I want to move forward. So I pick one sort of big picture bucket project. I pick one content project from the content project bucket, and then I pick one from the administrative project bucket, right? And so based upon that, I typically structure my day such that I work on either the content project or the kind of like big picture work project in the morning, right? Because that's when I usually have the most creative energy. I haven't gotten caught up in meetings or administrative tasks, which for me, and I think this is probably something that's somewhat universal for a lot of people, once you kind of get in that, meeting zone or like administrative task zone, or start responding to emails or Slack messages, or just kind of like checking off collections of like minor tasks, it's really, really difficult to pull out of that kind of just like frenzied reactive brain mode to actually be like, okay, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to ignore all these like little tiny loose ends that I just opened up. And I'm going to just like focus on whatever, coding this little piece of connection that pulls in data from somewhere that wasn't having the data pulled properly. It's very difficult to make that transition. So I try to prioritize the big picture work project or the creative project in the morning. And then I typically have meetings that start in the middle of the day. And, once you start meetings, then it's like, okay, cool. We can really just start focusing in on these administrative tasks. And then in some cases, I actually do find that working on a creative task later in the day can go okay as well, right? Because I do on occasion find that in the morning, I'm a little bit overly vigilant and a little bit overly critical, let's say, of creative work. So if I'm trying to write in the morning, I just might have a really hard time like actually getting something to come out, right? Or if I'm trying to design programs, sometimes in the morning just doesn't work well, just like everything that I write or think about writing for an athlete to do just doesn't seem right. And I'm just like being overly hard on the work and not letting it flow out. So on occasion, I do find it better to actually let that sort of wait until later in the day. And so that's essentially the tiered system by which I organize priorities. And then the actual projects themselves, those exist very much on like a getting things done, quote unquote system, right? So basically I'll have projects I use Asana for my project management tool, but it really doesn't matter. I've seen people do systems in Evernote. I've seen people use OmniFocus. I used to have a to-do list on my phone called Toodle-Do that was actually pretty fantastic. And I don't think that app is being supported anymore, which is unfortunate. But each of those projects then, exists in this idea of like having very clearly what the next action item is, and then potentially having contexts surrounding like where and when that action item can be done, right? So this is a key component of the getting things done system, which is that each project needs to have an action item. So, your project shouldn't be something like car. Your project shouldn't be something like fix dashboard. Your project shouldn't be something like write article. It's like, okay, what is the actual project such that the project itself can be done, and then what is an actual action item that can be, very clearly, solidly next action that can be contextualized. So if we use something like car, it could be, for example, I had a license plate, I need to replace my license plate, and the screw into it, the screw on the license plate was just like completely rusted and destroyed and stripped, and there was no chance it was coming out, right? So I need to actually find someone to take it to. There's an auto body shop right around the corner from my place. So an action item for that would be potentially call auto body shop and see if they'll actually accept my stupid request to unscrew a bad license plate bolt, right? And so that's something that I would actually put on my to-do list or in my project list such that I can, okay, I have a window where I'm going to do some administrative tasks. Here's one that's relatively easy to knock out. And based upon the time commitment and the energy commitment, I can just go ahead and do it. So again, to sort of summarize that, it's like big picture is, what is the most important thing to actually be working on to move whatever organization or project or whatever forward. Then from there, what are the specific sub projects of that have a very clearly defined and definable outcome? And then below that, what are the actual things that need to be done on each individual day? And what I've found by doing this is that this gives me a decent amount of both structure and flexibility, right? That those are the two things that you sort of need to be playing off of each other constantly, right? I do know people who have success with essentially using their calendar as their to-do list, right? That they basically just block everything off in terms of what needs to be done. And they just say, okay, cool, I'm going to work on this project for these 2 hours. And then I'm going to go to these meetings from this time to this time. And then I'm going to block off, a commute to the gym. And I'm going to work out from this time to this time. And that seems to work well for them. I've found that doesn't work very well for me, because it doesn't give me enough flexibility. And with a lot of the stuff that I do, I'm very, very bad at actually estimating the time that it's going to take properly. And I have done some stuff where, I write the amount of time that each task actually does take me in my my daily to-do list, just as a calibration mechanism. But even then, it's like, especially if you're messing around with software or trying to fix something that's broken, the calibration on how long something is going to take, that's even with practice is really, really difficult to do, right? So trying to be too prescriptive with planning like that for me has resulted in a lot of failures and a lot of stress, because I'll block 2 hours on my calendar to potentially write, let's say, athletes' exercise programs, and I attempt to do it. And I just find that, my brain is absolutely not going to be able to write programming right now. And in an ideal world, I'd be able to just kind of quickly swap something in and swap the programming out, because trying to push through too much friction is something that I found doesn't work terribly well, right? And that's not to say that I never push through friction, because I do it all the time. I did it to record this. I was like, I don't necessarily feel like getting in front of the microphone and talking right now, but I want to make sure that this is done and ready to post. So I just kind of force myself through the friction. But there's other times, especially with something like exercise programming, where, if it's going well, it can go very well. It can be sort of like a pleasurable activity. The programs just sort of flow right out. You feel like the athlete is going to make some solid progress. The progressions make sense. And then there's other times where it's just not happening. And trying to force it is not a good use of time, because it can, potentially triple the amount of time that writing a single program would take. And then also, the quality of it is probably going to be worse as well. So I found that I need a lot more flexibility than being too rigid with scheduling like that allows for. But simultaneously, other people will just sort of have these not organized large lists of things that need to be done, and then just sort of say, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll decide to do this today. I kind of don't feel like it. I'll just pick something easier off the list, or just feel overwhelmed by the list in general and just sort of start reacting to whatever is happening in my email inbox, right? And that's the other side of failure mode, from being overly structured to being not structured enough. And I found that organizing these things in sort of weekly priorities and then daily buckets gives the right amount of structure of okay, if I can move each of these projects forward and not even necessarily finish it, right, but move it forward in a given day, then, I feel pretty good about what I've done for that specific day. And then I this is something I should have mentioned previously. I actually write the weekly priorities out the night before, right? So I essentially look at how far did I get in this specific project this week or this day. And then, if I want to just carry that project over to the next day as the priority, then I can do that. So for example, I do also sort of think about my days of the week, being allocated to different types of activities. So I do have some days that I attempt to focus more on, doing management type of stuff for the gym. I think of some days as days that I try to do more content creation stuff for my own site or for Legion. I think of some days as being days that I attempt to do more, programming and program design and communicating with athletes. So I do have these kind of theoretical structures to the week, and I can use that in combination with these buckets of projects to sort of select what I'm going to be doing. So to give an example, I've, like I said before, I've been working on improving our dashboards, right? Just our ability to kind of track and pay attention to numbers and communicate those effectively. And, this is sort of a nebulous project that has a lot of different things. And I've been trying to split it up into very clear next actions and then very clear sort of outcome defined sub projects. And so one of the things I'm trying to do again, which is something that's like more challenging than it quote unquote should be, is display active membership holds over time, right? So in the month of September, how many memberships were on hold? In the month of June, how many memberships were on hold? And so to do this, it seems like something that should be relatively straightforward, but from the way that our data is structured and the way that we actually visualize it, it's more challenging than it should be. And so that's something that, seems like, okay, cool, I'll just like fiddle with this for a little bit. It will take 30 minutes to get it done. And that's just not the case at all. This is something that's been like a multi-hour project over several days. And so, I've worked on that for 2 hours the other day. And then I decided, I'm not going to carry over that project to tomorrow, because tomorrow I need to prioritize actually finishing writing these exercise programs. And then there's a bunch of just like administrative stuff that's piled up, just kind of like nebulous admin garbage that needs to be done for the gym. And I know if I start fiddling with the membership holds again, that's going to take me hours and I may or may not be done with it. So something like that, I'll just say, great, I'm going to add this to next week's project priorities list and kind of carry it over, right? So this combination of these buckets that you're sort of slotting stuff in and out of with the project list, without necessarily having this like rigid, okay, this is due today, even though it's not actually quote unquote due today, and gives the right amount of flexibility for me to be able to adjust on the fly and sort of react to, how I'm feeling, what my sort of appetite for certain types of projects is, how much firefighting I've had to do in a given moment. And so that's a good balance to be found. And again, everyone is going to sort of have to have their own way of kind of solving those problems. But, hopefully just by framing it out like that, that might give some folks an idea of ways that they could improve either their own flexibility, let's say, because some people, like I said before, tend to be much too rigid in terms of their organization of what they're doing, compared to other folks who might just not be rigid enough, right? That they're not actually clearly defining their projects and they're not clearly defining their priorities to actually work on it. So hopefully this is helpful. Like I said before, let me know if this is helpful, especially this format of myself just kind of talking through something or laying something out rather than doing, an interview and trying to ask questions of someone that I find interesting. Because if this is useful, I can potentially do some more of these kinds of things. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddneve.com. That's I before E, or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.